All right, good morning or afternoon to everybody that's joining us now. For those of you who have joined, I'm going to launch a poll that just kind of gauges a little bit on who we're chatting with this morning. And if you can use the chat function as well and let us know where you're calling in from, that'd be pretty rad. Awesome. So a couple breweries that are open, a couple in planning. Great. If you have any questions throughout this presentation, please use the chat function or the Q&A. Happy to look at both. We're going to keep this pretty casual and make sure that we answer any questions that anybody has here. Most importantly, I want to thank Alex and Dustin for joining us this morning. This is a monthly webcast series, and as we've gone through it over the last almost 2 years now, we've been able to look at fermentation through many different lenses and perspectives. I'm excited to chat with both of you this morning, primarily because it's, this is a conversation that we've had at multiple workshops before, or, at the bar at the end of the day. But I think you both lend pretty interesting perspectives. We get so caught up in talking about how to actually handle yeast or manipulate your fermentation and what that does to the beer. But without both of you and what you do, there would be no opportunity to even do that. Alex, did you want to take a second to introduce yourself and ABS and then pass the mic to Dustin?
Yeah, so my name's Alex Smith. I am a sales consultant with ABS Commercial. I am based in Denver, Colorado. Our corporate headquarters is in Raleigh, North Carolina. So we're a complete brew house and brewery supplier. We also own and operate a 20-barrel production brewery in Raleigh called Raleigh Brewing Company. So that kind of combination of our businesses and kind of knowledge bases come together so we can talk about this stuff.
And what's your specific role and background in all this?
So I'm a sales consultant. I actually helped open the brewery for the first couple of years and was head brewer and production manager there. And then upon moving to Denver, switched over to the equipment and consulting side. So I do sales, a lot of sales support and sales consulting, and then also go on site and commission all the brew houses that we sell.
So you've had your hand in selecting equipment, developing, and actually working on probably plenty of different brew houses then, yeah?
Yep, I would say easily hundreds.
Awesome. And Dustin, do you want to give a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. My name is Dustin Houck. I'm an architect. We specialize in brewery projects. We do them all over the country. We've done almost 200 to date. We help with feasibility studies, evaluating potential sites, looking at kind of what your process and business model is, and helping select the right equipment to meet those volumes in production that you're shooting for when it comes to fermentation capacity and planning for that expansion, knowing what your brew house max capacity is, and deciding on what size and fermenters and the layout and for the best process flow and production.
Awesome. So, I mean, traditionally, how would you two work together, right? Somebody wants to start a brewery, usually from the supplier standpoint of White Labs, we don't really see that brewery or customer until they're already established, right? I always stress that I wish people would call us before they open and learn more about, what our lead times are, what different products we offer. But traditionally, when somebody's trying to open a brewery, how might two positions in companies like yourself work together?
Go ahead, Alex.
If you want to take that first.
Sure, I certainly can. So we usually have clients are coming to us first to really start looking at spaces. They have somewhat of an idea of what size system they might want to do. They may have talked to a few suppliers. So I start talking to them about why they're selecting the size system they're wanting to do. What is their model as far as tap room, distribution, and so that can kind of establish what their production volume needs to be. And we have some kind of universal numbers for what systems can do, but once we can lock in the equipment supplier like Alex, we can get actual turns, number of turns per day that the system can do, and try to kind of establish what that maximum capacity is. And then we can use that based upon their percentages of ales versus lagers and fermentation times, kind of build a model that explains how many fermenters they need when to hit certain production volumes, and working along with Alex in that too, because coming from some background sides of the actual brewing processes, and being able to kind of dial in if we start hitting some of our max numbers, how to maybe increase those efficiencies to boost a little bit more production out of a maxed system.
And is that something that an architect would traditionally do, lend insight to throughput, or
I doubt it. I think it's just because of our background and how many breweries we've done. I started with a home brewing background, was home brewing for about 25 years, had some friends that were opening up breweries. I knew the architectural side of it. And so we started kind of doing a lot of breweries about 10, 12 years ago. And it just kind of snowballed into us kind of becoming experts in the breweries and the brewing process. I mean, I know a lot about beer and about the process and how it's made and what that means. But with the number of breweries that we've done, we really learn about different vessel types and different methods. Even if you've got a big barrel program, it's going to change your square footage needs. And if you're lager heavy, then it's going to change that as well because of the longer fermentation times. And we just know what every vessel does and why you'd want one. And so we can kind of help optimize how that layout should work to make it best work for your process flow.
Yeah, I would definitely say Dustin is, his firm is very unique in supplying some of the production information, even, having an understanding of workflow in the brewery and the cellar. What we typically see, we will start working with a customer around the same time as an architect. Sometimes they already have one in a building secured. Sometimes, they're waiting on a lease and then planning on bringing in an architect. So a lot of times we are kind of tasked with doing some of those things that Dustin mentioned, talking through production numbers. So I think there's different places that people can start. They say, I have this building and I want to just make as much beer as I can out of it, or I want to brew to a specific concept, or people will start with, I want a production brewery that's going to make 30,000 barrels a year. I need to find a building that'll do that. So I think those are kind of the two approaches that we see. We don't do a lot, like where I think Dustin and us kind of split is we'll do like crude layouts of where our equipment should go and, optimizing workflow, but we don't touch on things like utilities typically outside of, this is what you need to power our brew house, and, this is the glycol loads you need for the fermenters and that kind of thing. So that's where someone like Dustin definitely comes in, because you need an expert to really lay that stuff out. And a lot of it, knowing what the local codes are and that kind of stuff is all super critical.
Yeah, we'll look at all the utilities necessary, not just for the brewery, but if there's whatever other things you may have going on in the building, if you've got a little kitchen, an event space, looking at what those loads are going to be, your gas, your electrical, all your mechanical, water, sewer demands based on the entire operations, not solely just what's happening on the brewing side. And so we can kind of do feasibility studies looking at properties if you're still looking for a space, and identify, why is this space good or bad, or what are the issues we're gonna see as we develop on this project, so we know early on that yes, we're going to need to upgrade the water or the electrical service. We want to know those things as early as possible and put them into the budget, so we don't get a surprise later that we're underserviced in some way.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. How common is it? Is it's like a chicken or the egg? Is it usually that the building will be adapted to the brewing equipment that you're looking at, or is there kind of give and take on what type of equipment you can actually install based off of the existing building?
Every building really will have its limitations, whether it's utilities, ceiling heights, could be access doors for we're bringing product in and out. It's rare that we ever see a building that's like perfectly set up that has kind of all the infrastructure in place that we need. There's always going to be something, and so it's always just kind of a give and take. So sometimes the building is such a perfect location but has deficiencies that we'll just have to get by with, and knowing that it may not end up being perfect, but we can't. The location is just too good to pass up. And that's usually what ends up happening, is that either properties are just hard to come by and you got to take what you can get, or it's just in such a perfect location that we'll just factor those things into the budget early on and know that we're going to have a several $1,000s hit to add or upgrade electrical service. We just know that's happening and it's in the budget from the beginning.
Yeah, from our perspective, we kind of see, I would say it's about evenly split, what people end up going with. We have over time become kind of more and more flexible in our system designs based on specific needs. Ceiling height is probably one of the biggest ones that we see as a limitation. Kind of an important consideration that we always think of there is, on the smaller side, if you've got short ceilings, it may be that, for instance, a 5-barrel brew house will be able to produce more volume than a 7 if you can fit a 10-barrel a 10-barrel cellar tanks in there, but you can't fit 15s. So that opens you up to double batching, which is something you couldn't have done, because of your ceiling height on a bigger system. And then as far as utilities go, we've done everything from direct fire, electric steam. We've done a direct fire kettle with an electric hot liquor tank, stacked combo tanks, all kinds of stuff to, fit every use case. And that's something we found early on. We've got a range of stock designs that we've come up with that are, I would say, ideal for 80% of people, but there's always, people have tall ceilings, but very little floor space. So we have to make tall, skinny fermenters. The fermenters are definitely the most difficult in that regard because, as you well know, you start getting too skinny and too tall, you get that hydrostatic pressure, which can then change your fermentation profile. We can get a little more flexible with stuff like hot liquor tanks and serving tanks and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's really, I don't think I've ever seen like an absolutely perfect, building, or, there's always usually something that needs to be tweaked, or, you're having to make some considerations one way or the other.
Yeah, you see online a lot in some of the, breweries and planning groups, or, where people have these ideas of the perfect building, but they're going to need to put their cold box up a flight of stairs, or they don't have a traditional loading dock, or not really looking at the ergonomics of what some of those issues are. Are those things that you both encounter quite a bit? What are some creative ways that you've worked around it, whether it's maybe putting a brewery in a basement, or serving tanks somewhere else with a long draw to supply the bar?
We've done probably just about every layout there is. We've done spaces where there's not enough ceiling height. It's a 2-story building with or basement and a 1-story building above it, and so we've cut holes in the floor so that the tanks have more height and basically can rise up through that floor. We've done that several times. Some of the things we run into, a building that doesn't have any outdoor space to locate your glycol unit, they produce a lot of noise and heat. And so ideally you want those things outside. And sometimes if we just don't have the space for it, we've got to locate it inside. But then with the heat issues, the sound issues, and now potential weight issues, if we want to locate that unit on the roof, then we look at options by doing potentially split systems where we can put the reservoir on the ground inside the building, which is the heavy part of it, and then we can put the condensers on the roof that gets the noise and the heat out of the building. It's not ideal, but it does work, and we've done that on several occasions. There's really, just about every situation, unless we run into a building code issue where, number of exits or distance between exits or something just can't be achieved. For the most part, we can make a lot of buildings work. Like you said, if you got a smaller ceiling, lower ceiling, that might limit what you can do fermentation wise, and your size of your largest fermenter, and so maybe that'll dictate your brew house size. As I was just saying, if you can't fit a 15 but you can fit in 5s, it doesn't make sense to go with a 7-barrel brew house. You just do it with 5 and you can double batch into it, because 7 you're just wasting space.
Yeah, and there's getting creative. Just again, in tank design, we've done all kinds of what I would consider somewhat strange stack designs. We've also seen horizontal fermenters and lagering tanks become a lot more popular. I think we're seeing lagers in general start to make at least something of a resurgence. And when you start stacking them, that kind of offsets a lot of the kind of space that you would waste compared to the cylindroconical design. So yeah, I mean, I think the biggest takeaway is that brewers have a tendency to be pretty resourceful, and us who are in the industry of supplying them kind of have to adopt that mentality as well, and figure out creative solutions. So
yeah, no, Eric, you guys use stacked fermenters at White Labs. I think that for you guys, it's more just of a batch size, because you're doing such smaller batch sizing and doing variety of yeast strains. So you want to be able to split it up into multiple tanks. But we also see it if we just have very small floor space, we have plenty of ceiling height, but we don't want to do double, triple, quadruple batches. So we'll double stack single or double batch tanks just to take advantage of that floor space. It raises a little bit of operational issues, just because now your man-ways are up higher, but that can all be worked around. So we've kind of done it a lot of different ways, just depending on the building and what the production model is for our client.
Yeah, we some of the pictures that you sent over and some of the upcoming slides might show it a little bit better, but how often are your customers like taking into account just like the visual impact of that layout, right? I think it's, ideally you would find an empty warehouse somewhere to make your beer and just sell it over a bar downtown, right? Because that's where the expensive real estate is. But I think it's very important for the consumer to know that it's made there, right? Does it really make a big difference if it's shipped in a truck, 3 miles down the road? Probably not. But when you walk into a brewery, it's really important to look at that processing equipment. And I think it might have been Long Beach a couple of years ago when we walked into, I don't even remember the name, some brewery downtown there, and they had the big plate filter, hanging over the catwalk there. And I think it was just something that we started talking about, right? How important is that generally to a lot of customers that you guys are working with, and the aesthetic design of it and placement?
It's strange. I think it's very important, and that the whole reason that somebody goes to a brewery to have a beer is to basically be immersed in that experience and be a part of what's happening. We do on occasion get clients that they, for whatever reason, don't care about being able to see it, and I strongly encourage them trying to make it a part of the experience, because that's the entire reason for doing it. So we try to put equipment, whether it's static fermenters or brew houses, front and center as much as possible. I know a lot of brewers won't like to be sort of in a fishbowl and potential for getting bugged with questions while they're trying to work. So sometimes the brew house part of it may not be up front and center, but that's really kind of a client decision on what they'd like to have front and center. We've done brew houses right up against a customer railing, and that brewer needs to know that he's going to be interactive with customers all the time. It really just depends on what they're trying to do, but yeah, we try to make it part of that experience as much as possible.
Yeah, I would say for us, kind of as Dustin said, it's probably only 50 or 60% of the people that we work with, really like have that as a consideration. I think, a lot of people are just kind of content to build production space, and I think you can also build a nice production space and have a kind of a separate but very, cool ambiance tap room that, I've seen murals of the brewing process, and there's other ways that I think people do try to integrate it, but I agree. I think it's pretty important. I mean, just on a very basic level too, you're spending a lot of money on equipment. You might as well use it for decoration too. I mean, it looks nice, it's shiny, it's something that most people don't get to see every day. So, I mean, yeah, to me, it seems like a no-brainer to kind of make them serve double duty.
Whenever we do separate them, we'll try to put, at least a glass wall between it so you can kind of see it. And some of that really will have to do in like bigger spaces when we're dealing with, maybe more temperature control issues we're trying to deal with. And that previous slide, that was a larger brewery that we were designing, and basically it's a big glass wall behind the tap wall that lets you still see everything that's happening back there, but we can temperature control those two spaces differently because that was in a fairly warm region. So we may not necessarily air condition the brewery side of it, but we definitely need to on the customer side. So some of that kind of comes into play as far as the climate, but still being able to see it and know that it's there and know that why you're there instead of just at a bar.
Yeah, and at our facility, I mean, we've got a roll-up door that separates the tap room and the production area, and we just, got a roll-up door that has windows, or they make full glass roll-up doors, so it doesn't have to be just like a glass wall.
Yeah, so when the weather's good, you can
throughway. Yeah,
open it up. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and we've all seen the pub brewers that get frustrated that they have to come in at 4 a.m. because the bar opens at 11, right?
Yeah.
And that's just indicative of working with what you got. But I think it's important to have that conversation, even as you said, Dustin, on like what that brewer is going to be, what's going to be required of them, because you might potentially have issues with staffing if they're frustrated that customers are bugging them all the time, or there's safety issues if you're trying to CIP and you're rating a tap room and you're having customers bug you while you're dealing with chemicals.
Right. Yeah. And on when it comes to your bright tanks and things, and when you're purging, there's certain things you don't necessarily want directly into the. I mean, it's one thing to have the customers nearby and can kind of see operations. It's another to have them like right in the mix. We get a lot of clients that want to put serving tanks like right front and center and serve directly off of them. It's a great concept, but operationally it can be a little bit difficult. You've really got to understand that you're not going to be purging and tanks during operations. So that's all got to happen at different times. And if it adds a complication, which is fine, as long as we make sure the clients understand what they're getting into, if that's what they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, as a bad example, I was at a small brewery in California a few years ago, and they were just getting started, and I think they were dropping hops out of a fermenter that was pointing straight at the bar, and 8 people that were standing in line to get beer got sprayed with, once that hop plug let loose, just got hit with a bunch of hops. And it's like, it's a you're in a brewery, you're definitely front and center, but yeah, you definitely have to be considerate of those safety concerns, and there's a balance there.
Yeah, I think those are some of the scariest videos on the internet. Is funny as people think that it is, when a fermenter starts gushing over and somebody's trying to throw a tri-clamp on it real quick. Yeah. Like, it's funny that everybody's okay, but that stuff like does, when you're dealing with a lot of pressure, that stuff can be really scary. So talking about, we were kind of talking about the design and more so layout, but maybe we could switch to talk about purpose a little bit more. When I'm approached by somebody that's trying to open a brewery, the first thing I ask them is like, what do they expect to do in the first year, and what do they expect to do in years 3 through 5? And it's surprising that a lot of people don't know the answer to that, don't have a true understanding of what their cogs are going to be for their beers, but let alone how their equipment's going to affect that. So maybe I'll just broadly open it up to both of you. What are some considerations that either somebody expanding or that's looking to open a brewery should be looking at with cellar space design and equipment selection, with the idea of throughput, turn times, what types of brands they're brewing, etc.
I would say, I mean, as we kind of talked, like volume is obviously an important part of it. Where that volume is going. So how much of it is, do you plan to go, to sell over the bar versus kegged in distribution or, in cans in the marketplace. Also, as we kind of touched on earlier, it's important to think about like the number of brands that you're trying to maintain. So we actually, over time, we've got a 20-barrel production brew house, but we ended up putting in a 3-barrel pilot system. And we've got some 7-barrel fermenters as well as 60-barrel fermenters. So we can basically brew anywhere from 3 barrels of beer to 60 barrels of beer, depending on the brand. Some of our super hoppy IPAs that we don't want 60 barrels of it, sitting around and not being consumed within like the optimal 4-week period. We may do 7 barrels of that or 15 barrels of that to keep that fresh. So those are definitely some things to think about. If you've got, a 20-barrel brew house and nothing but 40-barrel fermenters, you're gonna end up kind of hamstringing yourself on, you can make a lot of volume, but you may not be able to make a lot of variety. I think it's also important when you're first starting to do, be thorough in your business plan and have an idea of what you think are going to be your flagships. Also understand that as a professional brewer, you're brewing for other people, not for yourself. So what you think is going to be your flagship may not. It may be a completely different brand that you didn't expect. So, do your due diligence and plan as much as possible, but still leave yourself some flex room, in case things do change so that you can capitalize, on the brands that are doing well.
And you mentioned the rise in popularity of lagers. Obviously, we've seen an increased demand there. Has that affected outlook at all on, tank time for different brands when developing cellar space?
100%. And like I said, we are seeing a lot of people turn to horizontals too. So they'll basically do a quick primary in their conicals and then rack them into horizontals so that they can, turn more ales in those fermenters.
Mm-hmm. And
when
Dustin, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, when we start looking at something, very early on, before we really know what your process and what your tap room size and those kind of things is going to be, we start looking at essentially 1 barrel or 1 square foot per barrel of production per year, and that's at your max production volume. It doesn't work so well on when you get really small systems, but when you get into 7, 10 barrels and up, that really kind of comes into play, using those numbers as a starting point. And depending on that's kind of assuming about a 15% tap room and about a 15% cold box. So that rest of that, roughly 60-ish%, is kind of all of your brewery and cellar space. And so we try to look at that at like how much they want to make year 1 and then year 5, and what's the maximum that their system can produce, so that we can know what size space we're looking at. Because once they don't want to be moving all that equipment, trying to changing anything. And we look at laying out that cellar so that really the only thing you got to do to expand is bring in more cellar tanks. And how do we do that efficiently, be able to still get the tanks in, get them in line without disrupting operations as much as possible? Because you don't want to have your one free spot for fermenter back in a corner somewhere. You want it to kind of be easy to get to and bring in a tank. And then once we kind of understand their business model a little bit, if they're going to be much larger tap room, or you may have a heavier distribution model, they need a little more cold box space, or they're going to have anything like if they change their ale to lager ratios, that'll kind of change what that capacity needs to be. And if for some reason they have a different fermentation schedule, 14-day ales, 21-day lagers, if those numbers change, we can kind of plug that into our calculators and really kind of look at how much volume they're going to be able to do and kind of use that as a basis point. They say they're going to produce 5,000 barrels a year max, then we need to be looking for about a 5,000+ square foot space to get that into. And that goes in with all the other things that we're looking at in those spaces for ceiling heights, utilities, and different things. But the square footage is one of the first things, and then we can kind of give that information to a real estate agent. Say, look, this is what we're looking for. This is the square footage we need. This is the ceiling heights we need. These are the utilities that are preferred. You know, find us spaces like this. Don't send us a 3,000 square foot space that doesn't have natural gas, because it's not going to work.
Yeah, and I'm curious if your experience is the same that I've seen. Do you see people kind of working backwards when they're looking at designing a brewery, looking at cellar capacity first, or volume, and then cellar capacity, and then brew house? My experience is always everybody really looks at hot side first, right? That's kind of the sexy part of building a brewery. But and maybe elaborate if you disagree, but looking at how much you want to sell is most important, and then how to achieve that, right?
Yeah.
Looking at cellar capacity and throughput, and then the brew house, and actually how to physically make that work to get there.
Yeah, I prefer to look at the back end first, and like how much beer do you think you can sell, and what's going to be that maximum you'll ever need to sell, and then you can sort of back that down into what size brew house can do that. And then again, how hard do you want to work? I mean, you can do similar volumes on a 5 and a 10 and work half the amount of time on the 10. But then you look at how many beers you're going to have on tap. That can kind of change what you're trying to do as well. If you're going to have 32 different beers on a 10-barrel system, that's still a lot of brewing. You could do that on a 5. You can double batch when you need more volume of any particular beer. And it just kind of depends on what your kind of ultimate goal is. If you're feeding other locations, or what your distribution models are, really it's better to look at that. What your max production volume is going to be, plan for potential growth in the future, so you have the added capacity if you need it, and then back that down, and that will tell you what size system you need to get there, as opposed to starting with a 15 and realizing you only want to make 1,000 barrels a year. Well, that's a big system for really not pushing it. 15 can turn 7,000-8,000 barrels a year if you really push it.
Yeah, I think that's actually, it's a good point. I haven't really thought of it that way, but we always will kind of push back a little bit when somebody just comes to us cold and is like, I want to buy a 7-barrel brew house. And like, why? Or I want to buy a 5-barrel. And
Right.
The difference in price between a 5 and 10-barrel brew house, it might be 20-25%. I mean, it's not for double the volume. I think some people do, it's maybe they know another brewery in the area that's been successful on this size system, so they're kind of trying to emulate, but it is definitely much more beneficial to look at your volumes, and especially your volumes over time, and work backwards.
And having that room for that expansion too, because you can do, if you design the system right, you can do half-size batches on a bigger system, and work less hard, and just ramp your way up to it.
Yep.
And once your demand grows, that system can do it. All you've got to do, maybe you have maybe you bought a 10-barrel system instead of a 5. You're working half as hard. You get busier. You start brewing more often. You bought all 5-barrel fermenters. You can exchange those for 10s. Sometimes, if we know that might happen, we'll leave space where that 5 is, to a little bit wider room around it for the next tank, so we can swap it with the 10, or maybe you're going to swap a 10 with a 20 later, so that those tanks are easy to swap in and out. You don't want to be changing your brew house once you get it in place. So going a little bit bigger, working a little bit easier, and ramping up, so you've got that capacity when that demand comes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those where, like, trying to open up on a shoestring can sometimes be the most expensive way to do it, because if you open it on a 3-barrel, I always kind of tell people to bet on their success. If you're feeling kind of timid and open up on a 3-barrel and you blow up, and in 3 months you can't make enough beer, and half your taps are empty, that's not good for anybody. You are now going to need to reinvest in at least a bigger system, possibly a bigger building. The other big thing on the cellar side to remember is to size your chiller according to the maximum load that you're ever going to have in that facility, because that's another very expensive piece of equipment. and to swap it out, you're basically buying 2 chillers. You can always resell the smaller one, but you're going to take a big hit. So yeah, really kind of look towards the future, and I think really break down those assumptions that people are having with, you know, where is the starting point? And I think as we've, you know, kind of designated, it really is your final volume each year, and really looking at least 5 years in the future.
Yeah, and that's what we look at when we start laying out a system in a space, is designing it for the maximum production volume. So we can design that cellar floor to hold enough cellar capacity to get you to those volumes. And then you can build that floor and have it sized right. And we just back out the tanks to what you're going to start with. So that all you've got to do to expand, we've already got the glycol system in place. The valves are there, they're just capped. All you've got to do is set a fermenter in place, hook up your lines, and it's pretty much ready to go. And you just, all you're doing is now turning your brew house more often to hit those volumes. And it's way easier to do that than change out your brew system.
Yeah, and the other thing that we will usually tell people when you're opening is it's okay to start with a couple less fermenters. You don't need to start with your cellar complete. You know, you don't need to open with 6 fermenters and 2 bright tanks. You can open with 4 and 1, and you can bring in, you know, we typically keep those common sizes in stock or in production. So once you start to sell beer, once you have money coming in, if, you know, money is really a concern up front, that's where I would encourage people to, you know, scale back at the beginning, because we can bring those in quickly, you know, as you're ramping naturally.
You can use your revenue as opposed to your funding money to add those tanks later.
Yeah, and don't skimp on the stuff that's, you know, hard to replace or expensive to replace down the line. Get that stuff in place early, and then, you know, kind of build your cellar to suit.
And what so you mentioned you know, 4 to 1 fermenters to bright. Is that just like a common rule of thumb? Do volumes affect that ratio at all? Is there any benefit to have more or uni tanks? Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more, specifically you, Alex, on that.
It really depends. You know, this is one of the areas where I think everybody kind of has a different approach to a cellar. I typically think 3 to 4 fermenters per bright is a good mix. I know plenty of breweries that are making really good beer, and a lot of it using just unitanks. The main trade-off with only using unitanks is you're typically going to tie up that tank a few extra days for clarifying. With the fermenter to bright, you can basically fine inline into the bright, whereas with a unitank, you're having to you know, add those findings directly to the tank, and that typically has a longer settling time because you're not getting as uniform a mix, and you also just, you have, you know, trub and stuff that's clung to the top of the fermenter, so your yields are typically going to be a little bit less on the unitank method, but again, if you're really tight on space, a strictly unitank approach can be perfectly effective. As I meant, like, you know, the horizontal tanks kind of serve as brights as well. Those have the benefit too, because they're obviously only, you know, 4 feet tall versus say 15 feet tall. The yeast has a much lower distance to travel, so they'll typically flock out quite a bit faster. And then the other kind of point of consideration, I meant to mention this on the last slide, but figuring out that split of how much you're doing over the bar versus how much is going into distribution. I'm a big proponent of serving tanks if you can use them. Those will effectively, they can replace a bright tank, but the biggest benefit is the space savings, because with kegs, you have to consider it's not just the keg that you're filling that's taking up space. We typically think for each tap handle, if it's in-house or in an account, you're going to need at least 4 keg shells to cover that, because you'll probably have 1 or 2 that are dirty, 1 that's on, and 1 that's in reserve. So we're talking 8 kegs basically per barrel. Whereas with a serving tank, again, you can make that skinny and tall if you've got tall ceiling heights in your cold box. So that, I think, if you know that you're going to be doing a lot of volume over your bar, I strongly encourage people to go down that road. Also, given that kegs have gone up in price astronomically, the kind of cost difference definitely starts to come into play with these serving tanks. So
Yeah, and previously, we were talking about, when we're talking about scaling up production, being very literal, expanding cellar capacity, but we were talking about different processing aids or different pieces of equipment to aid in that. Do you have any suggestions on ways to look if you want to scale up your throughput, but you don't necessarily have the ability to add new tanks or a larger brew house? I mean, we've got different yeast strains and fermentation profiles that help with that. But is there anything on the equipment side that could aid in that?
I would say, like, kind of going from cheapest to most expensive. Findings are obviously the cheapest and easiest, and those, be it kettle findings or cold side findings, those can cut down a couple of days or even a week of your clearing time. I don't have a lot of experience with filters. I know that they are cheaper typically than most centrifuges, but they have more of a continuing cost associated, where it's having to replace filter plates or buying DE. They get beer really bright. I think depending on the filter you use, there can also be some flavor stripping that occurs. Mm-hmm. We eventually brought in a centrifuge into our facility, and that was a huge boon for us. They are probably the most expensive of the 3, but they, as long as they're kept in good maintenance, it's not as nearly as much of a continuing cost. They're also nice because you can really dial them in. So like, we'll even throw our New England IPA goes through the centrifuge, just really light. And that's basically so you don't get, when it is canned, you don't have a ½ inch of, slurry sitting on the bottom of each can. But then we also put our Pilsner through it until it's crystal clear. So for us, and each, I think, depending on your brands, that metric is going to kind of change a little bit. Our flagship is a Belgian that uses a yeast that's not very flocculent. So the centrifuge enabled us to cut almost 5 days off of basically just our fining time. And that's a huge, you extrapolate that over 8,000 barrels over a year, 5 days per batch. That's a huge cost saving. So I think we ended up doing the math, and the centrifuge paid for itself in 9 or 10 months.
Yeah, that's crazy. What are the general, before we get to this next slide, what are the general rules of thumb when it comes to cellar capacity to production volumes? If I wanted to open up a brewery that's a pub that's doing 1,000 barrels a year across the bar, generally how much capacity should I have to achieve that? I'm looking at 20 barrels, 40 barrels, 60 barrels of tank space. What are the general guidelines that you guys see or suggest for that?
Dustin, I'll let you hop in on that, because you've got the good equation for the ale lager split.
Oh, there we go. We have some calculators that we use for that when we start looking at your system size and how many times you're going to brew to get up to a production volume. And if you're shooting for, say, a 1,000 barrels per year, and we kind of break that down by your fermentation time, assuming 14-day ales, 28-day lagers, and then what percentages of each go for that. So if we take that into account, look at like a 75 ale, 25% lagers, that puts you into about a 60 barrel fermentation capacity to do that. And that can be broken up into whatever, however many, whether you have 5, 10s or 20s or whatever it is, but that, that's, we kind of have calculators going to work on that. And it depends on, like I said, it depends on how much of that is ale, how much of it's in lager, and what those fermentation times are going to be for each one of those. And so that's kind of what we use to determine, we'll look at, that's kind of how we determine what your maximum capacity is, and looking at how fast can you turn that system in a day and how many days a week do you want to do it. So if you plug in just a 10 barrel system and you turn it 10 times a week, assuming double batching every day, that gets you into about the 4,800 barrels a year point. And then we trickle that down in that same calculator for percentage of ale versus lagers, fermentation times, and come up with, a 260 barrel cellar capacity. And then we start talking about whether we're doing single batch, double batch, or even triple batching to size that cellar based upon what that maximum volume is for it. And then, as I said before, just back it down to what you're going to do opening day. But you got room to add those tanks as you watch your sales numbers and your projections. And if you're projecting double sales next year, well, you better be getting those fermenters on order so you can hit those marks and not end up with empty taps.
Yeah, so you're essentially not leaving money on the table, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. We mentioned cold storage a little bit, but I think that's just one of those biggest gripes is cold room space. How is that something that's generally sized, and how is like cooperage and serving vessel type taken into account when determining how many square feet of cold room, or maybe a kitchen wants to share it, right? How often is that done correctly, and how often is it done improperly in both your experience?
I'd say improperly would be sharing your food service with your beer cooler. Don't do that, because you'll end up with fighting for space, and they're not exactly the same way of handling their goods and the sanitary purposes between them. So if you're going to have a food component, let the refrigeration be completely separate.
Sure, that's the right way to do things, but we've all walked into a cold room and seen the opposite. So
yeah, a big box of onions right next to the fermenter. It's a little strange to see sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, there's like, you can never have too much cold storage. It's one of those, kind of brewery laws. If there is space, it will get filled. What you think is like way too big when you start. I mean, we ended up doubling the size of our cold room after the first year, and then started putting pallet racks in, especially once we started canning, because then we basically had 2 separate inventories. We've got all of our keg inventories, which are palletized, stacked 2-3 high, and then pallets of cans. So that's definitely a big consideration, is not only how many brands, but how many different packaging types you're using, because those are all going to need a dedicated space.
Yeah, we refer to those as like pallet positions. So you may have an area for brands, but you may have multiple pallet positions based upon what it's in. It's cans, bottles, 22s, 12 ounces, kegs. That's going to take up more space than a single, one brand with one product type.
Yeah, and I prefer, like, if you can do it, having like for your tap room, having a dedicated like serving cooler, and then a distribution cooler or whatever. That's where I think, again, serving tanks are really helpful. If you can minimize having your bartender, run into the distro cooler, but really just mess with kegs, period. That's super helpful. And also, just with inventory purposes, like the fewer people that are in a specific cooler full of product, the better. Things get moved around, things get lost, things, they walk away.
When with your TTB as well, we run into, pre and post tax product needs to be separated. And so
Yeah,
if we are going to share the distribution box with the tap room box, sometimes we'll, basically put a chain link fence in between the two. And so when it crosses that line, now it's the taxation changes one way or the other. And that can also help, keeping a bartender from moving a keg into the wrong area. You certainly have a dedicated separation between those two so that you don't have any of that crossover.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's like one of the biggest issues that I've dealt with is inventory management.
Yeah, for us too, what we also look at is what equipment are you going to use in that box. If you're just going to have a dolly and maybe a pallet or a keg stacker, you can only stack too high. So there's no real reason to put in a 12-foot tall cold box because you can't do anything with what's above that. An 8-foot box, you can easily stack 2 kegs high, have a shelf above that for maybe some finished cans, or maybe you're storing hops up there on the upper shelf, stuff that it's not too heavy that you can lift manually. But then if you start getting into wanting a forklift, well, now we also need not just room for those pallet positions, but now room for that forklift travel. And so that's also when the door locations become very critical, so that we're not wasting any space if the door's too close to the corner and you can't get anything. There's not enough room for a pallet position there. What's that space for? It's just wasted your refrigerating space that you can't use. And if you're doing, the bright tanks and the serving tanks, if those are outside of that box, you're jacketing them and temperature controlling. You can control them at different temperatures potentially than your cold box. You have more control over them, and it frees up that cold box space for your distribution.
Yeah, that's sounds spot on. Again, I wanted to thank you both for taking time today to do this. I think it's a pretty awesome conversation to see it from multiple perspectives, and it's not a conversation and content that I see readily available, especially so candid. So I appreciate it. But just to reiterate and kind of wrap up what I think we spoke about is to think about big picture and kind of look at sales volumes and projections first and work backwards on how to actually achieve those in order to run a successful business, but B, ensure that you can physically produce the amount of the volume of beer that you're looking for. And just defining the goals around that. If anybody on the call or watching this in the future wants to contact either of you or your companies, what's the best way to do that?
For me, it's just email. So it's alex@abs-commercial.com. And if you want to share that, in the link or whatever, that's fine with me.
Cool.
Yeah, email is usually the best way to reach me as well. It's just Dustin@hauckarchitecture.com. It's HAUCK. And feel free to post that. Anybody wants questions, feel free to reach out to me. We answer lots of questions all the time.
Awesome. Yeah, and as always, for us, whitelabs.com or education@whitelabs.com if you have any additional questions. But again, thank you all for joining. Safe travels, Alex. I'll catch you at CBC in a couple weeks.
Sounds good.
Yeah, definitely. We'll see you there.
Thanks, guys.
Yes, this will be available as a recording on the White Labs YouTube channel. Give us about 24 hours to post it, and it will live there indefinitely. All right. Well, thank you, and I'll catch up with everybody later.
Cool.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you very much.
See you guys.
Cheers.
See you soon. Bye.